Individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're starting from page 285 of the translation. So we're on the first chapter of the psychical individuation, and then we're on subsection 6, the affective problematic affection and emotion. So we missed last week because I was sick, but the week before we saw the sections on the trans individual. So he introduced this concept of the trans individual. Well, actually, he's introduced it before, but he develops it a little bit more here. And he talks about how he brings up this concept of spirituality. There's these two sides of spirituality. So there's the side that corresponds to eternity or immortality. After our deaths, we live on through others, and the individual sort of persists as an absence in other people's lives. And then the other side is the side of spirituality that is a sort of momentary gesture or something that appears and then disappears, and that doesn't have that quality of eternity. So these two sides of spirituality are equally valuable or equally important. And so Simondon argues that sort of traditional humanism has focused on the first one, on the side of the eternity, and it talks about these eternal works of culture, whereas in order to get past this kind of spirituality of or this humanistic approach to spirituality, you have to have an equal emphasis on both sides, or an equal recognition of both sides. When you have just one side emphasized over the other, or taken as a sort of independent reality, you end up with science or faith as these two sort of opposed cultural domains, or two aspects of human reality. So science would correspond to action without emotion, and then faith would correspond to emotion without action. That spirituality that grasps both sides, both the eternal and the momentary, is something that is prior to the opposition between science and faith. And then we saw the section on anxiety, and here Simondon argues that anxiety is sort of the what happens when an individual, or a subject, I should say, is sort of deprived of their insertion into the collective. The individual subject, by virtue of not having that insertion into the collective, or that incorporation into the collective, the emotional orientation of their life is restricted in this way. So they're not capable of solving the problems that affectivity poses, and so they end up in this state of anxiety. And anxiety is a sort of dead end in most cases, though Simondon allows for the possibility of a transformation through anxiety. But he says that in general, we don't have this transformational quality, so it ends up being a dead end. And there was a question from Angus in the chat about, so does spirituality have to have both aspects? All spirituality does have to have both aspects. I think Simondon would say yes, that there are both aspects, but it's a question of sort of degree of one or the other. Like his example of the gesture of the slave who's running away from their master is something that is not sort of preserved in the culture. It's not something that has that sort of value of eternity in the same way that a famous poem or a monument or whatever does. But at the same time, you can, it has a sort of afterlife in a way that you can see that, for example, the Spartacus rebellion in ancient Rome served as a symbol or an inspiration for future liberation movements. You have the Spartacus Bund in early 20th century Germany, and in the Haitian Revolution, there was also some reference back to Spartacus. This gesture that sort of disappears as soon as it's produced can be repeated. It can be an inspiration for future gestures, and can have that spiritual value of eternity in that sense. Okay, so let's get started on the text for today. So we're at subsection 6. I'll read the first page or so, and then we'll go around as usual. Okay, subsection 6, the affective problematic, affection and emotion. Affectivity has a problematic status because it does not merely consist in pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are perhaps the dimensions according to which the initial polarity of affectivity operates on the world and on the subject, but affectivity can no more be reduced to pleasure and pain than sensation can be reduced to lines and angles. There are sensations in a world that is oriented and polarized according to lines and angles, just as affectivity consists in affective qualities that are oriented according to pleasure and pain. However, we can no more extract affective qualities from pleasure and pain than we can produce sensations from the dimensions according to which they are organized. The dimensions of sensations are the field of movement that are in harmony with them, just as pleasure and pain are the field of insertion of affective qualities into the living being. Pleasure and pain are the taking root of actual experience in the existence of the living being, in the structures and potentials that constitute it or that it possesses. Pleasure and pain are not just a reverberation of what the being has experienced. They are not just effect, they are also active mediations that have a functional sense. Even by considering affectivity as a reaction, it can be asserted that the sense of this reverberation is the dimension according to which the affective state polarizes the living being. For each affective experience, pleasure and pain are the sense of affectivity. Affections have a sense, just as sensations have a sense. Sensation is organized according to the bipolarity of light and darkness, up and down, interior and exterior, right and left, warm and cold. Affection is organized according to the bipolarity of joyful and sad, happy and unhappy, exhilarating and depressing, bitterness or bliss, the degrading and the ennobling. Pleasure and pain are already secondary aspects elaborated from affection. They are dimensions relative to the whole being, whereas the primary affective qualities may not be strictly compatible among one another without mutual integration according to pleasure and pain. But to put this relation into the vocabulary of critique, pleasure and pain are the a priori forms of affectivity rather than the affective given. Each affection is polarized simply according to a directivity internal to a qualitative dyad. Multiple qualitative dyads are initially uncoordinated. They each constitute a relation between the subject and the initial experienced. A coordination between the different experiences makes possible an integration into the subject that proceeds according to frameworks, or rather dimensions, constituting a veritable affective universe. Okay, let's stop here for now. So the concept here that Simondon is sort of gradually introducing is one that we've seen a few times before, and it's this idea of tropism in relation to sensation. And so, if you remember, a tropism is an orientation of a living being towards some sort of gradient in its environment. And so we can think of the example of sunflowers that orient themselves towards sunlight. And there's many other examples in the world of living organisms. You have bacteria that swim upstream towards higher concentrations of sugar or whatever. Any sort of differential polarization of the environment in terms of more and less of something an organism can orient itself towards. And so for Simondon, what he's suggesting here and we're building up towards here is the idea that affectivity has the same type of structure as sensation. It has this polarization structure, so that in the same way that sensation has to do with this orientation towards light and darkness, or warm and cold, or other pairs of polar opposites. In the same way, affectivity has this orientation towards these pairs of polar opposites. So he gives examples here: joyful and sad, happy and unhappy, exhilarating and depressing, bitterness or bliss, the degrading and the ennobling. So any affective state is going to be is going to take its place in the affective life of the individual by by relation to this polarization. And so this is what he means by saying that pleasure and pain are the a priori forms of affectivity. So there's this is so affectivity has this general sense of polarization in terms of a positive and a negative term. So rather than saying that affectivity, that pleasure and pain are the contents of affectivity, we instead say that they constitute the form of affectivity. So affectivity exists in relation to some sort of polarization into positive and negative terms. And so each of these affective states has this directionality built into it. So it's related to this qualitative dyad. So some pair of polar opposites, and the sort of initial state, or the more basic state, is one in which each qualitative dyad would be sort of independent of the others. So there's no coordination between all the different qualitative dyads, and it's only afterwards that you have integration of these different qualitative dyads into what Simondon here calls an affective universe. So it's a space, an affective space made up of multiple dimensions. So each of these polarizations constitutes a dimension, and an affective state would occupy a portion of that affective universe. And we'll see in the next bit that this unification of affective universes has to do with action as well. So there's a it's not something that is self-contained in the affective domain or sphere.
Non-manifest. Can we talk about, maybe get some clarification on some certain concepts that Simondon utilizes, like terms such as dimension? Because I think there's like certain scientific terms or even mathematical terms that he disposes himself to using, and I wonder if it helps to clarify that, so that we're all kind of in terms of refining the interpretation, and being able to have a collective analysis, if we can sort of clarify certain terms. Like, for example, dyad. I'm wondering whether dyad is similar to, my reading of it was that it kind of has an edge, or is tethered, or similarity to his discussion of sense as a precursor to sensation, or being bound to sensation, because later he does use the word sense at times, and that can be confusing, because are we talking about semantic sense, or are we talking about affectual sense as it relates to sensation? So I guess my question is, later, we're going to see that he starts referring to gradients in another kind of subtext. So I feel like some of these terms are bringing forth an underlying subtext, often that is mathematical or engineering based. So for example, dyad, I'm wondering whether in this case he uses the word dyad to refer to almost like something similar to, is it mechanical, like a sensor? Because later I'm going to find that when he talks about gradients and sensation, I can understand the concepts that he's referring to better when I think of it as that there's like this sensor. So I'm wondering whether this dyad is similar to almost like a construct or an object relating to sensation akin to a sensor.
Right. Yeah, so a couple of the terms that you mentioned were the dyad and dimensions. So for the first one, for dyad, I think what he has in mind here is Plato's use of the term dyad. Plato talks about the indefinite dyad um, um, in relation um, to participation in various ideas, so that there's like the indefinite dyad is the greater and the lesser, or a pair of opposed concepts in that sense. And so here, when Simondon talks about the dyad, um, the qualitative dyad, it has to do with the way that sensations are always relative to some sort of more and less in some qualitative sense. So sensations are always like visual sensations are always in relation to light and darkness, and then um, in the case of temperature, it's always in relation to heat and cold, or warmth and cold.
Okay,
And so,
yeah, so he's probably going to. That's what he does later on. I think he kind of extrapolates or fleshes out the dyad um, in the coming paragraphs. I think when he does talk, like you pointed out, does talk about like temperature, and then the discussion of the gradients. I think he tries to well he gets really descriptive on these topics of sensation. So I guess at that point, I can contextualize that as him elaborating on the dyadic um, sort of way of understanding it. I hesitate to use the word dimension, though. You know, and sometimes I have to substitute various spaces to try to interpret it currently, because there's this underlying kind of mathematics that is brought into account, like integration uses differentiation a little bit. Sometimes I feel like it's weird because, yeah, I found at least in one instance where the integration felt like it was more of a differentiation. But it reminds me of the notion of the integral in a calculus. And so again, we get into this. It seems like he is applying a kind of um, a philosophical method that's similar to a calculus at times.
yeah, with relation to the concept of dimension, I think we can think of the scientific concept of a state space. So if you have some sort of experimental setup where you're varying, say, the concentration of some chemical in a solution, and then you're also varying temperature, you can sort of model the set of possible states of the system as a space of two dimensions. So you would have one dimension of the concentration of the chemical and another dimension of the temperature. Um, and then if you have more different variables that you're modifying, you would have more and more dimensions. So you could have I don't know, a dimension of pressure, a dimension of, I don't know, magnetic field or whatever. You can add more and more different um, dimensions to your state space, and so we can think of the same type of idea here with the affective space, so that each of these polarizations, each pair of opposed concepts or opposed affective states, So whether it's joy and sadness, or happiness and unhappiness, all these different affective states that come in these pairs of opposed terms, each of those polarizations would constitute a dimension, and then any given affective state would find its place within that whole multidimensional state space.
Okay, well, here's where we get into a little bit of terminological inconsistency, because like the dyads that are mentioned there, what you're referring to as the affective states, I mean, all the granularity and the specificity that Simondon goes into, it seems to me that those terms, once the individual can get into a place where where he or she can recognize a term for the affective state, couldn't we say that at that point they have reached a recognition of an emotion? I find that what I'm trying to say is like the joy, sadness, and the other relations, their endpoints are emotions as opposed to affectivity. It seems my reading of it was that affectivity is more, it's kind of within the dimension of particularities that are not well defined, that are moving around, trying to find organization in an interiority, almost like particles or aggregates, not well defined. That seems to be where the place of various affectivity. So, yeah, I guess I'm still struggling with the distinctions between the aggregation of affects into emotions in the interiority of the individual, and the summation of seeing how it all kind of gets pulled together into the individual capable of the trans individuation. But that's towards the end. I think things kind of get structured and pulled together in terms of perception and emotion. So I don't want to take up too much more time.
Yeah, Angus has suggested that we continue, and I think that's a good idea, because there's some of these concepts are developed more as we go along, and we can sort of make more sense of what Simondon is doing as we see him put the concepts to work. So yeah, let's go on to the next page. If someone else would like to read from However, Affective Universes.
I can read. However, affective universes, or rather nascent affective universes, lead only to distinct subsets that do not coordinate together, as long as action or the analog of action in its aspect of interiority does not intervene. The coordination of the initial affective dimensions cannot be fully accomplished in the subject without the intervention of the collective, since the collective is necessary for emotion to be actualized. In affectivity, there is a continual pre-emotivity, but emotion cannot emerge from affections by means of activity can only lead to an inferior synthesis that would be impoverishing and reductive. Affections, no more than sensations, do not contain their own key within themselves. And plus et, I think, or a new individuation be coordinated of the subject. Sensations do not only give rise to perception, but also something of the subject, something of the being of the subject. Similarly, the condition of the initial integration relative to pleasure and pain, or the different affective categories, are not affections alone, but something of the subject. Sensation and affection correspond to two types of the beings calling into question by the world. Sensations correspond to the beings calling into question as an individuated being with sense organs, and a being which therefore can be oriented according to various polarities in a world, that which corresponds to unidimensional and bidirectional tropism. Sensation is this presence to the world of gradients, and its correlate is the response to tropism, not reflex. For tropism is total and corresponds to a calling into question of the entire individuated individual. But tropism does not correspond to a calling into question by the singular world. There are several worlds of tropisms, contradictory or divergent worlds that incite tropisms without a common vanishing point. Perception seeks the sense or direction of tropisms, i.e., the sense or direction of responses coordinated with sensations. Sensation is the basis of tropism. It is a calling into question of the living being by the world according to a presupposed unidimensional schema. This unidimensional structure of the response is already prefigured in the nature of the calling into question, in the structure of sensation. The problematic that exists on the level of sensation is a problematic of orientation according to an axis that is already given. The structure of the sensorial world, and consequently also of the tropism that corresponds to it, is the indefinite dyad of cold and hot, heavy and light, dark and bright. Sensation is the expectation of tropism, and information signal for tropism. It is what orients the living being vis-a-vis the world. Sensation does not contain the object, since it does not localize, does not attribute to a definite being the power of being the source of the effects experienced in sensation. There is a manner in which the being is called into question by the world that is anterior to any consistency of the object. Objectivity is not first, nor is subjectivity or syncretism. What is first is orientation, and what contains the sensation-tropism couple is the totality of orientation. Sensation is the grasping of a direction, not of an object. It is differential, which implies the recognition of the sense or direction according to which a dyad manifests. Thermal, tonal, or chromatic qualities are differential qualities anchored around a center that corresponds to an average state, to a maximum of differential sensibility. Should I stop there? Keep reading.
Yeah, let's stop there for now. Yeah, so here's more explanation of this idea of tropism, and an analogy, I guess, between tropism in sensation and the directionality of affectivity. So in the same way that sensation has to do with insertion into this more or less, or the dark or the light, or so on. Likewise, affectivity is inserted into these gradations, and so because of this, we have the impossibility of solving the problems of either sensation or of affectivity within the domains taken as independent domains. So it's only insofar as the subject is part of a collective that they're able to bring about this integration of the sensations into a perception of an object, and then likewise that they're able to integrate the multiple affective states into an emotion. So there's as we've seen throughout this part, there's a sort of continuity between the individuation of an individual subject, psychic individuation, and then the individuation of the collective, and the formation of a trans individual. So there's no separation between these two forms of individuation. There's a continuity, and the problems of psychic individuation can't be solved purely at the level of psychic individuation outside of the collective. So Angus has posted the progression or ordering of these different psychic states or conditions. I'm not sure if we should distinguish between the tropistic subsets and the sensation. I'm not sure if we need to distinguish those as two separate stages, or whether we should. I think he would want to say that sensation is always tropistic. So what would be initial would be the initial stage would be the uncoordinated sensations. So sensations without the formation of a sensory worlds or anything along those lines. And then the next stage would be sensation with integration of the different sensory qualitative dyads into a sensory space. And then the next stage after that would be perception and then action. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so, because this is again, it's a sort of one of these long paragraphs that is a sort of continuous development. So it's I mean, we need to stop at different points to discuss, but it's sort of artificial to stop and break up these paragraphs. But yeah, let's go on to the next page. If someone else would like to read from for each type of reality.
I can read. 1 second here. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. For each type of reality, there is a center relative to which the relation is deployed. There is not just the highest pitched and the lowest pitched, the hottest and the coldest. There is a higher pitched and lower pitched than the human voice, hotter and colder than the epidermis, lighter and darker than the optimal lighting needed by the human eye, more yellow and greener than the yellow-green of the maximum sensitivity of human chromatic sensation. The real medium of each species is in each dyad, and the polarity of the world of tropism is grasped with respect to this medium. The constant error that has distorted the relational theory of sensation consisted in thinking that relation was the grasping of two terms. In fact, the polarity of tropism implies the simultaneous grasping of three terms: the medium of the living being between the hottest and the coldest, the brightest and the darkest. The living being seeks in the gradient the optimal zone. The living being evaluates the two directions of the dyad relative to the center in which it resides and which it occupies. The first usage of sensation is more transductive than relational. Sensation allows to grasp how the medium extends into the colder of one side and into the hotter on the other. The medium of temperature is what extends and splits directionally into hotter and colder. The dyad is grasped starting from its center. It is not synthesis, but transduction. Hotter and colder are deployed symmetrically relative to the center. In the same way, green and yellow occur symmetrically with respect to the medium of color, and the qualities of the dyad proceed in both directions and toward the extreme terms beyond which there is merely pain or the absence of sensation. Sensation relates to the state of the living being grounded in an optimal region of each qualitative dyad, coinciding with the gradient of the world. It is the grasping of the middle milieu of a bipolarity. Medium and bipolarity are part of the same unity of being, which is that of sensation and tropism, that of sensation for the orientation of tropism. Sensation is already tropism, for it grasps the structure according to which tropism is actualized. For there to be tropism, it is not required that a disadaptation produce the necessity of a movement. There is tropism in immobility as well as in readjustment. Should I keep going?
Yeah, you can finish this paragraph.
Okay. Sensation is tropistic in itself. It makes the living being coincide with the medium of a gradient and indicates the sense or direction of this gradient to the living being. In sensation, there is no intention to grasp an object in itself for it to be known, nor the rapport between an object and the living being. Sensation is that through which the living being adjusts its insertion into a transductive domain, into a domain that includes a transductive reality, the polarity of a gradient. Sensation is part of an ensemble that, in a certain sense, splits into pure sensation and pure reaction, but that normally includes tropistic unity, i.e., sensation, which is tropism actualized. A psychology of behaviors leads to ignoring the role of sensation because this type of psychology only considers separate reactions as reflexes. Reflex is an abstract element of reaction grasped in the tropistic unity, just as sensation is an abstract relational element grasped in the same tropistic unity from which the active side has been removed.
Right. So here we have the introduction of this third term in the relation of a tropism. So we have not just the light and the dark or the hot and the cold, but we have this medium, which corresponds to some sort of optimality for the living being that occupies that medium state. So we have light and dark in relation to the optimal illumination for a human visual perception. And then we have hot and cold relative to human skin. And so this, and so Angus had mentioned affordances in the chat here. And there's been, I think, a fair amount of research on sensory perception in human beings that shows that human sense perception is not generally oriented towards objective physical qualities like temperature, for example. So you don't actually, when you feel something to be hot or cold, you're not actually feeling the temperature because, for example, if you touch a metal surface at, say, 20 degrees Celsius, or a wood surface at 20 degrees Celsius, the metal surface will feel colder. And so what you're feeling is actually the transfer of heat across the surface of the skin. So either you losing heat or absorbing heat. And so in the case of the metal, because it's a conductor, it allows your body to transfer heat across the surface of your skin to the metal, whereas the wood is an insulator and doesn't allow as much transfer of heat. And so this is just an example of the way that human sensation has to do with relations to this medium term, so that your sensations are oriented around this medium term and are related to the medium term as more and less. And then so he characterizes this domain or this dimension of sensation as a transductive reality, and so this again is a term, one of Simondon's key terms that has these multiple different meanings. But here, what he's talking about is the way that the domain of sensation is structured as a sort of progressive structuration from the center. So rather than having sensation being built up of like atoms of sensation, which was the sort of default assumption of a lot of 19th century psychology, that you would have like a sensation of red and a sensation of C sharp and like all these sort of isolated sensations, and then they would be joined together through association to form, perception of objects and so on. So rather than having these atomic sensations, we instead have this structuration of the domain of sensations from the middle outwards. And so this is what he means by calling this a transductive reality. And then he also criticizes what he calls here the psychology of behaviors, or a behavioristic approach to psychology, which is one that that takes the tropism as a unity and breaks it up and only looks at one side. So it only looks at the side of the reactions or the behaviors that the experimental subject demonstrates in the laboratory. Oh yeah, sorry, I missed a couple questions here from Angus. So yeah, milieu means both middle and environment. Yes, that's right. So in this passage, Simondon actually uses the term medium or medium, the Latin term, most of the time, but he does use milieu at one point. So milieu can mean like the middle of a series, like or the middle of I don't know, the middle of a room or whatever. But it can also mean the environment or the surroundings in which something exists. So I think Simondon wants. I think that's why he used the term medium here, the Latin term instead of the French one, to try to differentiate between the two. So this is when he talks about the medium in this passage. It's the medium with respect to this transductive reality, or this gradation of sensations in terms of more and less. And then the next question was about the relationship between this transductive reality and analogy. So we understand a sensation analogically with respect to the medium. I think, yeah. So transductive thinking is Simondon characterizes it as what is valid about analogical thinking. Analogy is sort of the way in which we grasp a transductive reality, and so here, yeah, we would grasp sensation as this transductive reality. We grasp it analogically in the sense that we grasp it through its relations. So analogy is always is always a thought that has to do with relations. So you compare, A is related to B in the same way that C is related to D or something like that. And so in this case, we're grasping sensation in terms of the relation between whatever sensory state we're dealing with and the middle term, or the middle of the sensory series. And so we always grasp it in this analogical way.
So based on biological term transduction, what Simondong wanted to emphasize here was like the process of sensory adaptation, like kind of like a receptor of the external stimuli, and then recepting, and then receiving it, and then turning into like into her own, like its own kind of version of how do I say, like kind of like impulses inside. Like what I mean is like here the important thing is in terms of tropism, like the direction. As far as I understand, tropism has to do the direction of the adaptation. So the emphasis like the process, like the adaptation, sensory adaptation could be all different, because the process, I mean, transductive reality all different, things like that. And then that we can't really I mean define it as a kind of like a amalgamation or synthesis of the whole kind of sensory, I mean, stimuli, but the kind of like a different version can coexist at the same time. So the that's kind of like the meaning of here transductive reality, transductive transduction here.
Yeah, so you're right that in biology we talk about transduction in the sense of sort of translating from one medium to another, so that like when you have light strikes the retina in the eye of a mammal, for example, then that light energy is transduced, so it's turned into a different form of energy in terms of it becomes nerve impulses, and so it's transmitted to the brain in the form of nerve impulses rather than in the form of light energy. And so yeah, in biology, the term transduction is used to refer to this transformation from one form of energy to another form that occurs at the sense organs. But I think here Simondon was using the term in a different sense. I think the way that he understands it here has to do with, and again, this is so. It's sort of difficult because he introduces the meaning of transduction with reference to the example of the crystallization. So it's a form of analogical thinking, but we only grasp it by way of analogy. So the crystallization example is whenever you see the word transduction in Simondon, you can always think of the crystallization example. So in the case of the crystallization, we had this unstructured solution, and then it progressively crystallizes around a germ. So each layer of crystallization is structured by the preceding layer, and so this idea of like a gradual structuration of a domain is what he wants to draw out or take from the crystallization example and apply to other areas. So in the same way that the solution becomes crystallized in the crystal example, likewise in sensation, we have this domain that becomes structured starting from the middle. So starting from the medium term and then progressing outwards from there. So that's the sense. That's what he means by calling sensation or the sensory dimension a transductive reality.
Yeah, regarding sorry, go ahead.
Just really quickly, so can we conclude then, though, that this medium is a kind of range, right? Like this medium from which sensation moves its way out into the ends of the polarity, particularly in the context of sensation. It's a range, right? Kind of like even a sort of statistical mean or statistical medium, and it could vary a little bit from individual to individual, but that it's this kind of range. Because you just said that we start with the medium and we move our way out to the extreme. So I'm thinking of like a bell curve kind of would be an attempt at representing this type of transductive concept.
Yeah, I think in relation to an individual person or an individual living being, Simondon would want to regard this medium as being a point in the spectrum rather than a range. So there's a single, like in the case of light and dark, there's a certain optimal illumination that is like the best, and this would be relative to an individual person, but a certain degree of illumination is the exact degree of illumination that gives the best visual acuity. So it's not too bright or too dark, and you have the best possible perceptual situation. But then
Right,
when
but couldn't the optimal also be like a sphere? So like, certain points could end up being within this optimal range.
yeah, so I think once
precise.
you, oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say that I think once you start introducing multiple different dimensions to the discussion. So if you have, for example, color perception and illumination at the same time, you would probably have some sort of surface rather than a point. So you would have like depending on like certain colors are easier to see in the dark than others, right? And that's why we have like high visibility clothing that runners wear and stuff like that. So that
Okay.
so there would be this sort of a color surface or a color / illumination surface. So you'd have a surface of points along the optimal range for optimal human visual perception in relation to both color and illumination at the same time. It would form a two-dimensional surface, I would think, or possibly even more dimensions because color in itself has multiple dimensions. But yeah, so once you start introducing more than one sensory modality, then you start having a multidimensional medium.
All right, something to think about.
Ollie, you had another question or comment as well?
I just like was talk to ask question about like I mean maybe by reading further like I can figure out by myself. The thing is that but the transduction regarding transduction, yeah, as you said, that definitely like I mean related to crystallization. But at least like in this part, the transduction is some kind of process like how do I say the it's a kind of like a I mean repetitive, but the process of adaptation like well, I am just wondering like in the middle of the part like the it says like a transaction is not the kind of synthesis like I mean we can't manifest the thing as a kind of uh diversion like in terms of like a color for example like if we get the visual stimulus from outside like a yellow and then blue and then but it should not be the only like the green like it could be different according to the potential of an individual like a being whatever maybe I might be wrong but I'm not sure but here what I'm thinking is that transduction is like a to try to like a describe like the process of the taking on external stimuli and how it is adapted in the inside like in the milieu like yeah so kind of like the process of like the neutralizing the polarity of the sensory stimuli whatever.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting suggestion. I think though that Simondon would not want to describe sensation as something like an adaptation or a neutralization along those lines. I think he would say that it's only in action that you have something like an attempt to resolve the problems of uh, sensory experience or sensory reality through eliminating these, I guess, negative affects. So there's in sensation itself, there's no like attempt towards eliminating or neutralizing the sensations. It's only in action that you have this orientation away from the negative affect.
Yeah, maybe like I might utilize like a little bit like I mean we misused like some terms, but the the focus I wanted to emphasize like the part like a sensation is that through which the living being adjusted this insertion into a transductive domain into a domain that includes transductive reality, the polarity of a gradient, something like that. So yep, yep.
Right.
Maybe answer. Yeah, yep. So let me just think twice, like later, like by reading further, I would like make myself clearer.
Right. Yeah. I think what your last comment I think was right though. I think yeah. So in sensation, the individual orients themselves with respect to this transductive reality that is sensation, and so I guess we could call that a kind of adaptation. But I think the term adaptation suggests something like a accommodation or some sort of elimination of difference or something like that, which I think Simondon would not want to bring into the picture. So I think talking about insertion or insertion into a transductive reality, I think, is probably a better way of expressing it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Let's see, where are we? I think I've gone too far ahead. Yeah, so we're on 288. So I'll read the next page or so. Comparable to the structures of veritable sensation, affectivity contains structures involved in tropistic unity. Affection relates to a subjective transductive reality belonging to the subject in the same way that sensation relates to an objective transductive reality. There are modes of the living being that are not modes of the world and that develop according to their own dimensions without implying a causal reference to this world, and without directly organizing according to the dimensions of a gradient, i.e. without being part of sensation. An interoceptive sensation is often treated as a type of reality that does not consist in sensations and that in reality consists in affectivity. Affections constitute an orientation of a part of the living being with respect to itself. They bring about a polarization of a particular moment of life relative to other moments. They make the being coincide with itself through time, but not with the totality of itself and the totality of its states. An affective state is one that has a unity of integration into life. It is a temporal unity. As part of a whole, according to what could be called the gradient of becoming. The pain of hunger is not just what is felt and what reverberates within the being. It is also and above all the way hunger as a psychological state, endowed with the power of being modified, is inserted into the subject's becoming. Affectivity is the self-constitutive integration into temporal structures. Desire, the onset of fatigue, and the intensification of cold are aspects of affectivity. Affectivity is much more than just pleasure and pain. It is a way for the being at an instant to be situated according to a vaster becoming. Affection is the index of becoming, just as sensation is the index of gradients. Each mode, each instant, each action, and each state of the living being are between the world and the living being. This being is polarized in accordance with the world on the one hand and in accordance with becoming on the other. And just as the different dimensions according to which orientation in the world is effectuated do not necessarily coincide together, the different affective aspects constitute insertions into the subsets of the living being's becoming, not into a single becoming. Both an affective problem and a perceptive problem remain. The plurality of tropistic orientations calls for perceptive unification and knowledge of the object, just as the plurality of affective subsets calls for the birth of emotion. Emotion arises when the integration of the current state into a single affective dimension is impossible, just as perception arises when sensations call for incompatible tropisms. Emotion is affective contradiction overcome, just as perception is sensorial contradiction. Moreover, we shouldn't speak of affective contradiction and sensorial contradiction, for sensations and affections in themselves are not what are contradictory with respect to other sensations or affections. What are contradictory are the tropistic subsets and the subsets of becoming that compose these sensations and these affections with respect to other sensorial and tropistic subsets. There is no contradiction on the level of sensations properly speaking or affections properly speaking. They cannot be apperceived if this encounter of subsets does not take place. Sensations and affections are incomplete realities taken outside the subsets to which they belong and in which they operate. The non-coincidence of affections fosters emotion, just as the non-coincidence of sensations fosters perception. Emotion is the discovery of the unity of the living being, just as perception is the discovery of the unity of the world. These are two psychical individuations that extend the individuation of the living being, completing it, perpetuating it. The interior universe is emotive, just as the exterior universe is perceptive. It shouldn't be said that affection flows from emotion felt facing the object, for emotion is integrative and richer than affection. Affection is like emotion in slow motion, i.e. emotion not yet constituted in its unity and in the capacity to become the master of its own development. Emotion is characterized by the fact that it is like an insular temporal unity with its own structure. It drives the living being, gives it a direction, polarizes it, takes up its affectivity, and unifies it. emotion unfolds, whereas affectivity is merely felt as the belonging of the current state to one of the modalities of the living being's becoming. Emotion responds to a being's calling into question that is more complete and more radical than affection. It tends to take time for this calling into question. It presents itself as a totality and possesses a certain internal resonance that allows it to perpetuate itself, to sustain itself, and to prolong itself. It imposes itself as a self-maintained state, whereas affection does not have any active consistency and allows itself to be penetrated and to be driven off by another affection. There is a certain closure of emotion, whereas there is no closure of affection. Affection returns, presents itself again, but does not resist. Emotion is totalitarian just as much as perception, which, after having discovered forms, perpetuates them and imposes them as a system that acts as its own support. There is a tendency of the being to persevere in its being on the level of perception and on the level of emotion, but not on the level of sensation or affection. Sensation and affection are realities that befall the individuated living being without assuming a new individuation. These states are not self-sustained. They are not determined in themselves by a self-conditioning. On the contrary, perception and emotion are metastable. A perception clings to the present, resists other possible perceptions, and is exclusive. An emotion also clings to the present and resists other possible emotions. The disruption of this metastable equilibrium is what allows for one perception to replace another. One emotion only comes after another emotion due to a sort of internal break. Sorry, I read more than a page because there's no good stopping point. Yeah, this is one of our famous multi-page paragraphs. So he starts here by criticizing the idea of affection as consisting in interior sensation. So the idea is that affective states would just be perception of states internal to the individual, and he suggests that this is an inadequate grasp of affectivity because it doesn't account for the way that affectivity or affection has this temporal unification when it is incorporated into emotion. So there's affectivity has is integrated into what he calls here the unity of a life. So a living being's life history or biography is made up of a series of affective states, and so there's this unity from one state to the next, or continuity from one state to the next, and regarding an affective state as purely interoceptive would not account for this continuity across time in the same way. And so Angus has pointed out this is not a total unity. It's so we have this sort of continuity. Continuity might be a better word than unity. So there's a continuity of affective states across time, but it's only in emotion that you have an integration. So that so he in the next page here he contrasts the way that affective states sort of succeed one another without any resistance. So you can have happiness or well, actually, I was going to say you could have happiness or sadness, but I think he would classify those as emotions rather than affective states. But you can have states of affect, of positive or negative affect that sort of succeed one another without necessarily having any sort of resistance. Whereas an emotional state, in the proper sense, is something that has this resistance or this tendency to persist. So if you're in a certain emotional state, you'll tend to continue to be in that state And even if, like, I don't know, if you're in a good mood one day, you'll tend to interpret the different things that happen in a positive sense, and so you'll tend to continue to be in a good mood. Whereas if you're in a bad mood one day, then everything that happens seems as if it's, you know, some sort of attack on you or whatever, and you interpret everything negatively, and then so you tend to continue to be in a bad mood. So emotional states have this tendency to persist or to continue through time in a way that affective states don't.
It seems like he's using emotion in the his technical sense again, as being like kind of the sense of action in the collective only. Is that right?
Yeah. So he's here using emotion in the specific sense in which it's contrasted with affectivity and in which it's always related to the collective. So it's so emotion is the action, the side of action through which the individual grasps it. So action is always collective, but it has this individual side to it, and that's emotion. And so we only have emotion through the collective, but it's emotion is the sort of the individual side of that collective action. And I think we can sort of make sense of this this insertion into the collective with respect to emotion in relation to the way that we have linguistic terminology for different emotions, so we can express our emotional state in a way that someone else can understand, and you can express an emotional state, even a very subtle and particular one, in linguistic terms, and someone else can grasp what you're talking about. So there's this sort of collective meaning to emotional states in a way that affective states don't necessarily have. So affective states are sort of like the precursors to these emotional states that you can describe in linguistic terms. Yeah, and so a question from Alyosha: are affective states more immediate and localized sensation? Yeah, so I think affective states are more immediate in the sense that they require less, I guess, cognitive development or psychic development. So you would start out as an infant having affective states of, you know, distress or happiness or um, whatever sort of set of states an infant has, that wouldn't necessarily be integrated. And then there's a process of integration of those states where at a certain stage of development, the child is capable of recognizing, you know, I'm angry or I'm happy or I'm sad or whatever. And so they integrate those affective states into an emotion that is expressible in collective terms. And yeah, so how does this link up with sensation? Yeah, so he distinguishes between sensation and affect. So these are sort of two parallel series. So both sensation and affect are structured in terms of this polarization, this orientation towards more and less. But they're distinct from each other. So it's only in the collective that you that perception. It's only in action that you have this unification of the series that begins with sensation and then the series that begins with affection.
Whenever I read like the Deleuze, like he also uses like affect. Particularly, I remember like the when he talks about like a Moby Dick kind of like how he used the word like to explain like the morbidity and then in the particular like meaning, philosophical meaning. So it's kind of a confusing and then like a tricky concept to understand. And then here, kind of like based on like the previous talk about transductive reality, compared to emotions, like affectivity has more than simple kind of emotion. So it's kind of a mingled some kind of emotions, like because like it has to do with like the process transduction. So some kind of from the milieu, like when it goes through the process of transduction, it can have a little bit different kind of like a meaning of more than a simple emotion. So here affectivity is like could be all different according to all different kind of a pre-potentiality, pre-individuality, because it is process individuation as well. Am I right or am I wrong?
No, I think that's right. I think yeah. So there's in the same way that you have the sensation is the insertion into this transductive reality. Likewise, you have affection as an insertion into a different transductive reality, so that there's a series or a dimension of each of the affective dyads, so that it's only in emotion that you have this integration of these multiple affective dyads into a coherent space in which the different emotional states find their place. Yeah, so I think that's right.
Thank you.
Okay, one quick comment that it seems like there's a lot of slippage in the, as you pointed out, the linguistic accounts of these thresholds or these integrations. So it makes it difficult to grasp exactly the bricolage or the tertiary aspects of how he pieces this stuff together, or sequences, or how it integrates, interrelates. So yeah, I feel like what he's pointing out here, though, which he summarizes well, though, but he doesn't state it in the last reading, is how the emotion seems to depend upon the experience of another. So outside of the individual themselves, they have to be sort of in a dyadic, there has to be a relational aspect to the true experience of the transindividuation of emotion. And that it seems that pretty much everything else would be an effectual stasis, and that a higher level of emotional experience would involve the individual. And this is a problem, especially if there isn't a lot of collective experience for the individual. There can be a slippage between their I feel like it speaks to me personally, because I notice that I could have a lot of affect in my action, and there could be an underlying emotion, and that could be flipped as well, which he points out later on towards the end in the matrix, or the the kind of reversal or the intersection, the transversal, the intersection that happens with emotion and perception. Anyway, I lost my point clearly, the clarity to my point at the end there. But I feel, again, the emotions involves another individual. The affectivity can kind of mask itself, but is always kind of one derivation below the emotion.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a I think when we talk about the collective nature of emotion, we should also keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be like in the same room as another person in order to feel an emotion or something like that. So there are certain aspects of our psyche which are collective in the sense that it's only because we're raised in a group of human beings that we have this certain emotional state or this emotional capacity. And so I think thinking of this in terms of language, I think is helpful because, of course, we only ever learn a language in a collective, and so we, insofar as our emotional states are structured in some sense by our linguistic understanding of those states, so that we recognize a certain state as being sadness or happiness or anger or whatever. Um, that in itself is a collective aspect of emotions. It's a way in which our emotional life is inserted into the collective. But then there are also effects where you can, like, for example, if you listen to an album at home, you might have a certain emotional response to it. But then if you see the musicians live, you might have a completely different response or a much more powerful response because you're part of this collective listening to it rather than just listening to it on your own. Or the same thing, like going to a play or a sporting event or whatever, any situation where you're part of a group or a collective that is involved in some sort of joint emotional response. I think you have a much more powerful emotional response than you do when you're on your own. So I think that's another another aspect to the collective nature of emotion for Simondon.
That's kind of important point, I think, like a collective point. So that's kind of like a distinctive spot between just emotions and then affectivity, because affectivity seems to be generated from emotion plus alpha, like a something more than one emotion, like, and then that is derived from like interaction with the milia and then lots of process of individuation, I guess. Right
I
or
wouldn't,
wrong? No.
yeah, I wouldn't exactly say that affectivity is emotion plus something else. I think
Oh no, not sorry. It's not exactly plus. Sorry, it's not kind of it's always a problem of like a choosing word. So it's not. I mean, like a mathematically plus is alpha or something like that. So you see here, like, how do I say it? It processes like the process of transduction. So by doing that, like the emotions is not stays as just emotion. It goes through some other processes, like which is like a manifested here transductive reality. What about that? Or better or not?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a better way of putting it. So that, like, in terms of in ontogenetic terms, the affectivity is more fundamental or more basic than emotion. So we see this in the development of children, in that they from birth they're capable of feeling pain and pleasure, or comfort and discomfort, and sort of basic affective states like that. But it's only as they develop and mature and start to learn words for emotions, and that they're able to actually recognize their own feelings and their own emotions, and then and so the emotions are a more sophisticated mental function than affectivity is. But that doesn't mean that they're sort of better in any way or something like that. So there's affectivity. You might take it to be a more immediate insertion into this transductive reality, so that you have a sort of immediate cognition of affective states in a way that you don't have with emotional states. So there's I don't know, a sort of value, I guess, to affective states that emotional states don't have.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so where are we? I think we can continue to the next bit. This was this long sentence. Yeah, so there is a relaxation from one emotion to another, on page 290. If someone else would like to read a page or so.
I can read. There is a relaxation from one emotion to another. In emotion, what disorganizes the living being is not emotion itself, since emotion is the organization of affections. What disorganizes it is the passage from one emotion to another. However, it could be said that perception also brings about a disorganization, but this disorganization is less appreciable, since it is merely a rupture between two successive perceptive organizations relative to the world. Since the disorganization that exists between two emotions involves the living being, it is more appreciable than the one that separates two perceptions. Nevertheless, perception and emotion are still activities that correspond to a transitory mode of activity. Due to their plurality, perception and emotion require a higher integration, an integration that the being cannot effectuate with its pure constituted individuality. In the perceptive contradiction and the emotional ruptures, the being experiences its limited nature facing the world through perception and becoming through emotion. Perception imprisons the being in a point of view, just as emotion imprisons it in an attitude. Points of view and attitudes are mutually exclusive. To unlock the possibility for the formation of a network of key points that integrates all possible points of view, and for the formation of a general structure of the manner of being that integrates all possible emotions, a new individuation must occur that includes the rapport to the world and the rapport of the living being to other living beings. Emotions must go toward the perceptive points of view, and the perceptive points of view must go toward emotions. The mediation between perceptions and emotions is conditioned by the domain of the collective, i.e., the transindividual. For an individuated being, the collective is the mixed and stable kernel within which emotions are perceptive points of view, and within which points of view are possible emotions. The unity of the modification of the living being and the modification of the world depends on the collective, which brings about a convertibility of the orientation relative to the world into an integration into vital time. The collective is the stable spatio-temporal. It is a milieu of exchange, the principle of conversion between these two sides of the being's activity, perception and emotion. By itself, the living being could not go beyond perception and emotion, i.e., perceptive plurality and emotive plurality.
Right. So this is a sort of difficult passage, or it's pretty abstract. but I think the way we can try to make sense of this is that so in perception and in emotion, you in each case have this limitation or this structuration into points in a network. So you have yeah. So I don't think emotive plurality is exactly to be identified with affect. I think what he's referring to here is the way that in emotion you have something like multiple attitudes, so that your experience of, I don't know, say a movie or something like that. Your experience of a movie is always colored by this attitude that you take towards it, um, and you can only ever experience that movie by through a particular attitude. And so you might have a completely different experience of the movie if you're watching it with a certain emotional state, as opposed to if you're in a different emotional state, you might have a different experience of the movie. And so I think this sort of limited character of the emotional attitude and the perceptual states are is what he's pointing towards here. Is so you can only ever perceive something from one point of view, or one sort of perceptual region, and then you can only ever experience something from a particular emotional attitude, and each of those points of view and each of those attitudes excludes the others, so that you only have this limited perspective on whatever aspect of reality you're considering. So there's this limitation sort of points towards a further integration in which you would have not just this limited point of view or this limited attitude towards something, but you would have this mediation between different different points of view and different attitudes. And so it's only in the collective that you can have this this integration of perception and emotion. So perception and emotion are themselves something that appear in the collective, but they're sort of the individual grasp of the collective, or their individual side of the collective, whereas it's only through the collective that you can actually integrate those two and solve the problems of emotion and of perception through action.
Actually, that's kind of, I just like thought a little bit like a while ago, like at the end of the affectivity is like not just solely like formed inside. It's a kind of like a formulated through the actually there is a particular word here, transindividuality, and then plus like perception. As far as I understand, the perception has to do with like external reality, which is like when we perceive something, we need the objects, and then the perceived based on also sensory motors, and then we can get some kind of visual stimuli or audio or smell or every kind of like sensory organs like stimulate like a perception of the objects, and that, which exactly means like kind of like kind of interaction with the external reality, and then that could be different from like what's going on inside. I would call it like emotions or affectivity, but at the end of the day all are integrated and then we can get some form of course that's kind of like always like fluidity, like it would be all changeable, but anyways, like at the end of the day, one's affectivity is process individuation, like it's kind of like at the end of the day, like the reciprocal reaction, reciprocal process with the outside and the inside all together collectively.
Yeah, so he definitely describes the line that goes from affectivity to emotion as being the subjective side or the internal side, and then the line that goes from sensation to perception as being the objective side or the external side. And then the idea is that we want to have some sort of integration of the two, so that we're not confined to one limited um, one limited um, uh, domain of perception or one limited domain of emotion. Um, so yeah, so I think that's right. The internality of emotion, and yeah, so Angus has pointed out this is a clear difference from Heidegger. Yeah, so for Heidegger, there's this idea of mood as having this sort of external significance, so that you sort of enter into a mood rather than having moods appear within you. And a mood is like a way for the world to be given. Um, whereas for Simondon here, he's maybe more traditional in thinking of affect and emotion as constituting an interiority.
One thing that threw me off when I was first reading this, the last part of this section, is that he seems to be using emotion in a slightly different, or in a different sense than the way he's been using it in recent sections, because it seems like he's been pretty clear that I think in like section 4, for instance, that emotion is only in the collective and is the, not something that the individual can achieve on its own, which was kind of the point of the anxiety section. But here it seems like the individual can have emotion, but in order to unify perception and emotion, you have to have the collective. So I assume it just seems like he's using emotion in a different sense here. It's not the same emotion that we encountered in section 4.
Yeah, I think so. It may be sort of a difference of emphasis more than a different use of the term here. But so when he talked about emotion as being collective, he or as having to do with the collective, and as something that the individual is not capable of achieving on their own. He mentions I forget exactly where, but he mentions the idea that emotion is the collective grasped from the side of the individual. So it's only so it's collective, but it's collective within the individual or from the side of the individual, if that makes sense. So that there's a sort of relative aspect to the collective nature of emotion, and it's only sort of relatively collective. And then so here in this last little bit, he's talking about trying to go beyond that relative incorporation into the collective to I guess an absolute incorporation into the collective. So it would be one in which you don't have this this just a, a sort of individual side of the collective, but the collective as such. And so that would be something that goes beyond the individual, not just insofar as the individual is not capable of performing or achieving this on its own, but it would be something that requires multiple individuals to undergo a new process of individuation. But yeah, I think you're right that there is a certain shift from earlier passages about emotion to this last bit here. Okay, so we're about at time, and we've reached the end of this section and of the chapter. So I think this is a good place to stop. So we'll pick up from 291 next time, and we'll go on. We'll go on to the next chapter, and then we'll see that he introduces even further distinctions in terms of individuation and individualization as two different sort of degrees or two different stages of the individuation process. So it'll get even more complicated next time. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining in, and I hope to see you next week.